If you feel like who you've always been is changing or cracking open, you're not losing your mind. You might just be awakening. This is the first video in a 3-part series on spiritual awakening. And in this one, I'm going to be talking about exactly that. What is a spiritual awakening? What often triggers it? What it feels like? And how it changes you. So strap in and follow along. So first, I will start by examining what do we even mean by when we say the phrase spiritual awakening. That is a very common phrase in the collective sphere these days. So what does it actually mean? Is it just some new spiritual, new age trend? Well, I often like to just resort just to the basics, and just by looking at the phrase itself, it means simply that, awakening to spirit. So there also is an implication in that phrase. If you are awakening to spirit, that implies that one was asleep to spirit. There is an implication in that phrase that many of us are born into some kind of dream. Essentially, that we are asleep. And what are we asleep to? So generally, there are what I would consider 2 predominant frameworks of how most people in our world view or process their way through this world. What is their concept of reality? What is that framework that they tend to live by? There are generally 2 pretty common ones that the majority of the world seems to fall pretty closely in. One would be what I might call the materialist type of sense. Generally, reality is only what can be perceived and measured by our primary senses. What can we see? What can we observe? Can it be measured? Essentially, from the kind of scientific point of view, if it can't be seen, if it can't be measured, if it can't be quantified, it doesn't exist. The other very common form of framework of processing this reality that we exist in would be more of the organized religion framework, where people tend to think, yes, there is a spiritual realm, spiritual experiences are real, there are spiritual beings, but they can only be experienced through intermediaries like a priest or a rabbi, and there are a lot of rules. Basically, it's a very strict box that you cannot escape from. You cannot move beyond that doctrine of what is acceptable in the spiritual realm. So the vast majority of the world very often fits pretty closely to one of these 2 frameworks. And essentially, spiritual awakening is when someone begins to have a stirring from within and they begin to ask that question, what if there's more? What if there's more than what I've been told? What if there's more than what I've been taught? What if there's more than from what these standard frameworks are offering me? Essentially, spiritual awakening is awakening to the layers of reality that we are not yet trained to see. So, what is that stirring that typically prompts that questioning of what if there is more? What initiates this awakening process? And typically there's one major variable at play in terms of this awakening process, and that is speed or pace. For some, awakening arrives like a lightning strike, whereas for others, and perhaps for most, it is a slow, subtle, gradual, yet inevitable process. And just to provide some context, generally speaking, all of humanity is currently in a process of spiritual awakening. Our entire world, our planet, and all of the beings on it are in a process of shifting to a higher plane of consciousness. Moving from these default frameworks of reality processing to an expanded higher plane of consciousness. That could be considered a spiritual awakening. Now, not everyone will reach a certain threshold that I will discuss later in this video. Not everyone will be fully reaching what we might call this kind of binary, completely spiritually awake threshold. But generally speaking, if you're watching this video, you are on a process of spiritual awakening, whether you realize it or not, because that is the process that our entire realm, our entire world is moving through right now, of expanding our consciousness. Now, the pacing of this is almost always directed from the soul level. This is generally orchestrated from the level of the soul. It is not necessarily being orchestrated by our own human selves. These are things that are chosen at the soul level. Generally, all of us are here because we wanted to experience this. We wanted to know what it was like to be in this plane of reality where there is a lot of density. There are these restrictive frameworks, and we wanted to know, what is it like to break through from that, break free from these restrictive frameworks of these boxes that limit our perceptions. So there are trigger events that are perhaps quite common for those who do experience especially these more robust, rapid types of spiritual awakening experiences. The most common one is what is often referred to as an NDE, a near-death experience. This can often come in a variety of forms, but generally someone could experience an experience where they are so close to death, perhaps they would even be pronounced clinically dead, but their consciousness went somewhere else and experienced something so profound, so beyond their normal waking life, that it shifted something instantly. When they return back into their normal waking consciousness, they are forever changed. That is a very common trigger event. Sometimes it's just a spontaneous spiritual experience that doesn't necessarily involve needing to go to such robust depths of approaching what we would consider death. Plant medicine journeys are also quite common. They are a great ground for expanding one's consciousness and experiencing alternate dimensions beyond our normal realities that we experience in waking consciousness. So plant medicine journeys are also an avenue that people experience trigger events. And sometimes it's nothing mystical or extreme. It can be through one's own waking life experiences. Major loss of a close loved one can trigger something so profound within somebody, or perhaps it's just general upheaval or rupturing in someone's external life circumstances. But not everyone needs such a massive trigger event. Again, as I mentioned, it can be a process of gradual, slow, subtle experiences that begin to move someone along on this spiritual awakening process. So I will share from my own perspective. I had a very rapid spiritual awakening. I had an experience so potent and profound to where my life is essentially split in two, before and after my own personal trigger event. I had a trigger event from a plant medicine ceremony to where essentially after that I was completely changed. I knew I was forever changed, even though I couldn't completely understand what was happening there. I was forever changed. And from that moment forward, there were many more experiences to come after that that were initiated by that one trigger event. And I did share somewhat robustly about my own personal spiritual awakening process. If you care to dive a little bit deeper on that, I did create a video on that. So I will link to that in this video here and in the description. But generally speaking, I had a very rapid spiritual awakening, and that is not required. It's not even necessary. It is not necessary. It is not even that common to have something crack someone open so quickly and rapidly. It's just what my soul chose. Now, a very common and almost fated experience for the spiritual awakening process is that it begins with rupture, a descent. This is often what is called the dark night of the soul. So after some kind of trigger event, if someone has one, basically what comes up must come down. Oftentimes, my own experience included, it was a massive light-filled experience. Sometimes, very oftentimes, the person ends up needing to come back down and experience the contrast and the inverse of that. But again, this doesn't necessarily need to be so dramatic. But as I mentioned, the entire world is going through a shift in consciousness. What this could be equated to is that there is an increase in light. Consciousness, light is consciousness. There is more light that is hitting our world, hitting our planet. And essentially, the light itself is the trigger. The darkness isn't the trigger. What's happening could be equated to if you imagine a pitcher of water, and in that pitcher, there's dirt at the bottom, there's dirt and sediment. Basically, it's a bunch of dirty water, but when it's just sitting there still, all of that dirt is still and at the bottom. But what happens when you start pouring in new high frequency, clean, pure water into that pitcher that's full to the brim, the first thing that happens is all of that dirt and sediment that's sitting at the bottom starts coming up to the top to be cleared and seen and released. So the light is the trigger. The light is what is causing these descents into darkness. So even if someone doesn't have such a robust trigger event, what often happens as someone is on this path of spiritual awakening, a very common, what you might even call a trigger, a more drawn out trigger, is disillusionment. Basically, being disillusioned with your life the way it is. You are no longer able to tolerate the things you used to tolerate. You used to tolerate your job, you used to tolerate your relationship, you used to tolerate where you lived. Now you realize something's not right. None of this holds as true as it used to for me. This isn't as meaningful as I used to find it. Or again, what if there's something more than what I've been told? Following this standard life plan that a lot of us are ingrained into, maybe that isn't the path towards happiness. Maybe there's something else. So disillusionment is very common and almost ubiquitous. This also brings along identity shedding. Essentially, you're realizing, I don't fit into this box anymore that my culture, my heritage, the society at large has tried to place me into. So you start realizing, wait, no, I'm more than this. I'm not just my job. I am not just a father or a mother or a spouse. I'm not just this business person or so on and so forth. I'm more than this. And you start shedding that from your identity. And as I've been alluding to, there's a desire for meaning, and you're realizing the way you've been living isn't it. It's not giving you the meaning that you're looking for. And eventually, all of that very oftentimes creates pressure and compression. And whenever you create enough pressure and compression, oftentimes there is a rupture of some sort. It doesn't need to happen, but it is common. And this is what can lead to what is called the dark night of the soul, which is a rite of passage. Not something to necessarily be feared or avoided, as there is gold on the other side of that darkness. But it is a very common initiation. Essentially, the structures that once defined you begin to crumble. What you believed about yourself begins to dissolve. Your mind might say something is wrong, but your soul is whispering to you, something is being born. After your descent, or perhaps even during the descent, it's not just about intensity and darkness. There are many, many amazing things that come through this process of spiritual awakening. So, what happens as the old starts to fall away? This is where many amazing things start to arise. As you start separating yourself from your old life and removing things that are no longer in alignment, things that are in alignment start to come in. So here's where things also about what you might call new abilities start to come online, because essentially you've made space for your true self to come online, and your true self has abilities and things that you weren't aware of that naturally have space to come online. But generally speaking, you start separating from your old life. And once you start separating from that, you're looking for some of that meaning, chances are you're going to find it. You start entering a searching phase. That is very common. Perhaps you start opening up to spiritual experiences or metaphysical concepts. And naturally, there's this desire to want to learn more. And you start devouring information, perhaps, or seeking out information. You start going down rabbit holes, finding people on YouTube to consume a lot of information, finding books to read, because a spark has been lit. And naturally, you want to scratch the itch. Then there are, what I was saying, alignment impulses. As you start separating and sifting things out of your life that are no longer in alignment, things that are in alignment can naturally fill that space. It can be uncomfortable, and this is where Again, it's kind of a simultaneous experience. There's darkness because you've perhaps cleared so much from your life that who you used that used to define you. There can be that little void space that's uncomfortable, but that's part of the process of for what is in alignment can now then fill that vacuum. A very common thing is that energetic sensitivity can now come online. These are the types of things that are natural to all human beings, but generally speaking, have been either repressed or reprimanded. It is pretty common, especially as children, that we all have what we would consider extrasensory abilities, very empathic. We're able to pick up on things that wouldn't normally be perceived by our normal primary senses, but either just due to the natural environment that one grows up in, or perhaps it was shunned from that environment. It's either repressed or it was never allowed to truly blossom and bloom. But now that you're starting to make space, these types of things can come online and they can be surprising, a little startling, but also can be very exciting. Um, Generally, here's the type of space where more intuitive openings can be allowed. Here's where what we might call spiritual experiences, mystical experiences, connections to the divine, to other dimensions can now start coming in because you are now on the process. You've shown to the universe essentially that you're ready for it. You're on this process. Show me what else is out there. If you start asking for what else is out there, don't be surprised if the stuff that's out there starts finding you. And then, as a byproduct, again, this is a simultaneous process of sometimes things going up and down at the same time, things getting better and worse simultaneously, darkness and light coming in at the same time. As I mentioned, this process often brings a shedding of your identity. Simultaneously, there is an expansion of your identity because once you start realizing the true divine nature of all things, you start realizing, oh, wait a minute, I'm everything. I am part of the whole. I am part of the all. I am part of the one living consciousness. So naturally, you're like, oh, you start to expand. So simultaneously, you're shedding some of these minor micro identities, but you're expanding into other massive types of identities that are now more of your true identity. So essentially, as the old structures fall, more of your true perception can come online. You feel more, you sense more, you remember more, you remember who you really are. The real you begins to come online without all of the false constructs that were layered on top. So now, let's put all of this together. So this is essentially one very robust rite of passage that many of us are walking. And yes, it can be destabilizing. And it's destabilizing because it's real. It's messy because it's transformative. Sometimes only at the precipice do people find the will to change. Human beings have this habit of sticking with things that are easy and comfortable and familiar. This spiritual awakening process forces all of us out of our comfort zone for our highest good. If this process is happening to you, it is not by accident. As I mentioned, these are the types of things that are orchestrated at the level of one's soul. So if you are moving through a spiritual awakening process, you can know that it is part of your destiny. It is aligning you to what is true, regardless of how uncomfortable it may be. So, awakening isn't an escape from your life. It is the beginning of living it consciously. It is the process of remembering who you truly are and why you're here. And what can be more important than that? So, I will reiterate again that I have walked this spiritual awakening path very intensely, very robustly, with a lot of darkness, a lot of upheaval, a lot of rupture. I know this process in and out, from its amazing highs to its terrifying levels of darkness. So, if you find yourself somewhere in this landscape, you are not lost. you're awakening. And if you are experiencing things that you don't understand, or experiencing things that if you shared with others, that they might think you're crazy, if you're experiencing things that are even terrifying, I promise you that whatever you may be experiencing, I have experienced something similar, and I can help you if you need it. I offer one-on-one support specifically for these purposes. So I welcome you to check out my website and check out my offerings of how I might be able to support you. I would be honored to do so, but of course there is no pressure. And with that, I'm going to begin wrapping up this video on spiritual awakening. In the next video, now that we have a clear understanding of what a spiritual awakening actually is, the next video will explore one of the most important parts of the awakening process, which is an inevitable but robust process of healing and clearing. This is involving oftentimes dynamics from past lives, ancestral connections, things like soul contracts, and more. So I hope to see you there. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was useful for you, and I will see you next time.